Today we want to take a look at the potential and need for reform of the other house in the Parliament of Canada, namely the House of Commons. And to assist us in doing this, we have Michael Chong, who is a member of Parliament. As you know, if you've been following Michael's career, he's put forward suggestions for improving the question period in the House of Commons and for improving the strengthening the backbenchers versus the front benches and the accountability of leadership to the members. Michael was first elected to Parliament in 2004. He represents Wellington Halton Hills. As a cabinet minister, he was president of the Privy Council. He was Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs and Minister of Sport. And as I say, more recently, he's gained attention by advocating democratic reform for the House of Commons. So welcome, Michael, and thank you for the work that you've been doing. Our second speaker who's going to respond to what Michael has to say is my old friend. When I say old friend, I mean we've been friends for a long time. He's not that old. Jay Hill, who for years represented the Peace River country in British Columbia in the Parliament of Canada. He was first elected the same year I was in 1993 as a Reform MP. And then following the 2006 election, Prime Minister Harper appointed him to the position of Chief Government Whip. And Jay's the only person I know that has been and in fact I think he's rare in the country this way, that's been a House officer with an opposition party, with a minority government party, and with a majority government party. So he's had a look at the relations between front benches and back benches and caucuses from those three very different perspectives. And so we're looking forward to hearing from Jay. But to start with, we'll have Michael come and talk on his views on what can be done to improve the democratic accountability of the House of Commons. Michael.
Thank you, Preston. Good morning. Bonjour à tous. Je vais donner mon discours en anglais, mais si vous voulez, les documents sont disponibles en français et je peux répondre à vos questions en français aussi. I want to thank Preston Manning for inviting me here today to speak at this year's Manning Networking Conference. As one of the year's largest annual gatherings of conservative minds, it's a pleasure to be here with you. The Manning Center for Building Democracy has been instrumental in the promotion of conservative ideas, and this year's conference is no exception. It's forums like this, where like-minded conservatives come together, not only to share achievements and future goals, but also to debate and discuss challenging new ideas that will take the conservative movement to the next level. Like many of you in this room, I've dedicated countless hours to the success of the Conservative Party of Canada. For over 20 years, I've gone to national and provincial party conventions, attended conferences like this one, knocked on doors, stuffed envelopes, and fought for the merger of our two legacy parties. I've run in 5 general elections, standing up for conservative ideals and for my constituents in Wellington County and in Halton Hills. And the reason why I say all of this is that I think of the Conservative Party like family. And like any family, we have our agreements and disagreements, we have our ups and downs. But like any family, we are honest with each other. And if we are honest, we will acknowledge that we have a problem in Parliament. The Senate scandals and last year's controversies about whether or not members of Parliament in the House of Commons have the right to stand and speak on behalf of their constituents make it clear that decades of changes to Parliament have weakened the role of elected members of Parliament and centralized that power in the party leaders. And it's clear that Parliament needs to be reformed. Barrels of ink have been spilt documenting the problem of the power of centralization in Ottawa. Countless books, journals, columns, and academic papers have been written. The problems in Parliament today are not the result of any one party or any one leader. They are the result of decades of changes through different governments of different parties and different leaders. And the party leaders themselves have acknowledged this problem. For over 20 years, party leaders from John Turner to Preston Manning party leaders from Paul Martin to Stephen Harper, have called for measures to address this democratic deficit. And despite all the barrels of ink, despite all the attempts to change, little, if anything, has happened. In fact, arguably, the problem has gotten worse. And so, the time has come to act. And to act we must, because Canadians are becoming increasingly disillusioned with Parliament and their democracy. The polls and studies documenting this are too numerous to list here. Now, parliamentary reform, as Preston mentioned in his opening comments, involves both reform of the Senate and the House of Commons. But I believe that before we reform the Senate, we must reform the House of Commons. Before we introduce democracy into the Senate of Canada, we ought to restore it to the House of Commons. And the reason for this is simple. The House of Commons is the only place in Canada where Canadians are democratically represented. I've served for over 10 years in Parliament and spent a quarter of my life in that institution. And I've concluded that the reasons for the democratic deficit in the House of Commons are threefold. First, party leaders approve party candidates in Canada. In fact, Canada is the only Western democracy where, in law, party leaders approve party candidates in all elections. Second, over the decades, our unwritten conventions of Parliament governing party caucuses have evolved in a way that have advantaged party caucus leaders and disadvantaged party caucus members and elected members of Parliament. And third, the role of caucus in reviewing the leader has been little used and the rules are opaque. And as a result, this has weakened the accountability of party leaders to their respective party caucuses. And as a result of these fundamental three challenges, Canadians are losing confidence in the ability of their elected MPs to represent them in Ottawa rather than the other way around. And voter turnout has declined, and many feel disconnected from politics and political parties in particular. In the last federal election, more than 4 out of 10 Canadians did not vote. And so, 3 months ago, in December of last year, the Reform Act 2013 was introduced into the House of Commons to address this democratic deficit. It proposes 3 simple, realistic, and attainable reforms to strengthen Parliament. First, it replaces the role of the party leader with a locally elected nomination officer for the purposes of approving a party candidate. Second, it requires a vote of caucus to either expel a caucus member or to elect the caucus chair. And third, it details the rules for the review of the party leader by caucus and for the election of an interim leader in the event that the review is successful or in the event of a death or immediate resignation. And what these 3 reforms will do is they will empower members of Parliament and give them the tools they need to better represent their unique constituencies here in the nation's capital. So why is the role of the Member of Parliament so important? Why the focus on restoring and strengthening the role of the elected MP? Well, because, quite simply, this. In many other democracies, citizens have 3 votes, 3 franchises at the national level. In the Republic to the south of us, Americans vote 3 times. Once for a head of state, head of government, the president, once for a member of the upper chamber, a senator, and once for a member of the lower chamber, a congressman or congresswoman. And so when they want their democratic representation affected, when they want their concerns heard, when they want to convince their democracy to do a certain thing, they've got 3 avenues to pursue. But here in Canada, Canadians have 1 vote, 1 franchise at the federal level. And that is a vote for their local member of Parliament. And Canadians rightfully expect that that local member of Parliament be empowered and be equipped to represent them here in the nation's capital. But studies done by organizations like Samara, that I know that Preston has worked with, show that Canadians feel that too often their MPs represent Ottawa back to them rather than them to Ottawa. Many Canadians feel that MPs too often listen to their party and party leaders rather than to their constituents. And that's why we need to strengthen and restore the role of elected members of Parliament. One of the things the Reform Act would also do is it would strengthen political parties, since they would be less likely to be decimated during a leadership crisis that comes along every 10, 15 years or so in every party. In Canada, we usually see huge swings in party seats that you don't see in other Western democracies. We go from majority government down to 2 seats. Other parties have gone from majority government to third-party status in the House, or from an election where the party was polling at 25% in Ontario down to single digits within a matter of mere months. And because the rules regarding the review of the party leader by caucus are unclear and unwritten, a leadership crisis in Canada tends to be a long, drawn-out affair, lasting months, if not years. We all know what the 2-year leadership crisis in the Canadian Alliance did during 2001-2002. It took the party to single digits in the polls in the province of Ontario. We all know what happened to the Liberal Party of Canada during the 2008 to 2003 timeframe, when they went through 5 or 7, depending on how you count it, successive leaders. It took them from majority status to third-party status in the House of Commons. Under the Reform Act rules, which are presently in place in other Westminster democracies, when there's a leadership crisis, the caucus comes together. Under clear and transparent rules, it makes a quick decision and either sustains the leader or votes to remove the leader and have the party outside Parliament elect a new leader. And instead of a 2-year crisis, it's a 2-week affair, and the party is not destroyed by a long, drawn-out leadership fight. Under the Reform Act, our party leaders would still be incredibly powerful. The party leaders would still appoint the party staff, still control who's at party headquarters, still control the party fund, and appoint all committee members and committee chairs. And the leader of the party in power, the Prime Minister, would still control the Government of Canada, its agencies, boards, commissions, departments, and Crown corporations. The Prime Minister would still have control over some 3,000 appointments, cabinet ministers and senators, judges, justices, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, heads of the military, deputy ministers and ambassadors, boards of directors and CEOs of Crown corporations, and the list goes on. Party leaders would still be immensely powerful. It's just they wouldn't be all powerful. The Reform Act would also strengthen grassroots democracy by restoring local control over party candidates and by strengthening local electoral district associations. It will ensure that candidates running in a federal election are connected to their local ridings and not parachuted into a riding into which they have never stepped, just like the rotten boroughs of old of the 19th century. And importantly, the Reform Act does not affect in any way, shape, or form the power that party members have today to either elect the leader as they currently do, whether it's a one-member, one-vote system like the NDP use, whether it's a delegated convention system or supporter class that the Liberals use, or whether it's an equal-weighted riding system that our party uses. It also doesn't affect in any way, shape, or form the power of party members to review the leader as they currently do, which in our case is after a general election where we do not form government. Now, by removing the party leader veto and restoring local control over party nominations, some have suggested we won't be able to control problem candidates. Well, first of all, party candidates under the Reform Act still can be removed, but instead of it being a decision taken in Ottawa, it becomes a decision taken locally. In addition, before the party leader veto was introduced by Pierre Trudeau in October 1970, Canadian politics, Canadian parliaments, Canadian elections weren't characterized by crazy and extreme MPs and candidates any more than we have today. And finally, we have a double check inherent in our system. First, local party members have to elect and nominate a candidate. And then the voters in that riding, in that district, have to select that party candidate to be their member of Parliament. And if both groups of people, both groups of Canadians, have decided that a particular person should be their elected representative in our nation's capital, then we should trust their judgment and their decision. We should trust them with the vote. Let me finish by saying this. We've come together at this conference to discuss next steps for Conservatives. I believe our next step should be to address the democratic deficit in Canada, and the Reform Act will do just that. It's clear that there is a democratic deficit, and it's clear that Parliament needs to be reformed. As I've said before, the challenges we face in Parliament and in our democracy are not the result of any one party or any one leader. But it is clear that there is only one party that should be able to and that can address this democratic deficit, and that's the Conservative Party. Ours is the party of the democratic reformers and the reform movement of the 1990s. Ours is also the party of traditional Tories who have always believed in the supremacy of Parliament. Last year, Preston Manning described the challenges we face as Conservatives. He said that we must embrace challenging new ideas, and he stated that parties who become afraid of ideas or that are only entertain ideas hammered on their own anvil and forged in their own furnaces are already suffering from a hardening of their political arteries, which can be fatal in the long term. So let us not be afraid. Let us be bold and strengthen Canada's democracy. Let's support the Reform Act, because if we are asking Canadians to trust us with another mandate to govern in 2015, then we as Conservatives must trust Canadians. We must trust that they have the maturity and the judgment to make the right decision, whether that's as local party members in selecting the local party candidate, or whether that's as citizens and voters in selecting the right party candidate to represent them here in Ottawa. And we must trust that MPs will make the right decision in balancing the interests of their constituents, their party, and their principles. And if we trust, Canadians in turn will trust us with another mandate to govern in 2015. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for those remarks, Michael. Thank you, Preston, for that kind introduction. It wasn't at all like the last time that a host turned to me and said, are you ready to speak yet, or should we let the audience enjoy themselves for a little while longer? So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to begin by thanking the Manning Centre for Building Democracy for hosting what certainly appears to be another successful networking conference, and for asking that I join in this discussion today about this particular topic of democratic reform. Second, I would like to commend Michael for taking the initiative for drafting, introducing, and promoting his Bill C-559, known as Reform Act 2013. And thirdly, having spent 17 years in the House of Commons and still very much recovering from that experience, I would like to not only provide comments regarding the details of C-559, but also offer a few observations of my own on other related subjects. As Michael laid out, the Reform Act primarily proposes four main reforms. He encompassed them into three. They are the ability of the caucus to fire the leader, ending the leader's ability to veto a candidacy by refusing to sign their nomination papers, the democratic ejection of MPs from caucus, and election of the caucus chair. So let's begin with the reform that has drawn the most media attention and is undoubtedly the most controversial, even though, as Michael said, it's in use in our sister parliaments, giving the caucus the power to fire their leader and replace him or her with an interim leader. Let me state here and now that if there is anyone, with the possible exception of my best friend, Chuck Strahl, if there's anyone who has reason to support a reform like this, it would be me. And the reason I have a fair amount of sympathy for this particular suggested change is my personal involvement in what proved to be a very messy and a very public insurrection against my then leader in 2001. Now, under our current system, before MPs who quickly become branded by their former colleagues and the media as dissidents ever go public expressing their opinion that for the good of their party, their leader needs to step down, they need to understand the potential consequences of their action. In all likelihood, the rebellion will result in the end of their political careers, irreversible damage to many close friendships, and possibly the end of their party's very existence. In other words, it's not a decision that is taken lightly. Now, having said that, I still have concerns with the caucus being given the legal means to overthrow the leader quietly behind closed doors. The leader is elected by the membership of the party, either by a countrywide vote of members or at a delegated convention. Either way, it is not a few elected MPs who decide the leader's fate. And I note that this bill should appeal to Mr. Trudeau because the definition of caucus does not include senators. I ask, is it an improvement for democracy to give a few dozen people the right to override the democratic franchise of potentially tens of thousands? And what of the thousands of grassroots members in constituencies that didn't elect an MP from that particular party? Won't they be completely disenfranchised? For they would have no voice or vote inside the caucus. Perhaps a better made-in-Canada solution would be a compromise whereby a majority of caucus could trigger a leadership endorsement vote by the party membership at large. As it happens, I designed and obtained the support of our current Prime Minister for such a system to overcome the problem of open nominations in incumbent-held ridings during our minority government. MPs having to face open nominations before every election works fine during majority governments, when everyone knows when the election will likely be, can plan accordingly, and the whip can allow MPs substantial time back home in their constituencies to adequately fight off a challenge. It doesn't, however, work when MPs are required to remain in Ottawa for critical non-confidence votes, while others hungry for their job work to take their nomination from them. So what we did was we instituted a ballot that was mailed out into incumbent-held ridings asking whether the membership of that constituency wanted a nomination race or not. We can debate what the threshold of returned affirmative ballots should be to trigger a nomination. However, this mechanism does accomplish the objective of eliminating vexatious challenges for nominations while ensuring the power to initiate a nomination remains in the hands of the party membership. To control costs, these types of important ballots can be included in a regular fundraising sustainer letter, which members are routinely plagued with. I believe that a similar system could be put in place to allow party membership to determine if a leadership race is warranted. Next, removing the power of the leader to refuse or presumably to dismiss a candidate. Again, while this reform seems to make some sense in delivering greater independence to incumbent MPs and even candidates who may never be successful, I have serious reservations about taking this legislated step. And I note that Michael framed it in the sense that we're giving power back to the people. But here's my concerns. First, we have all witnessed situations where an incumbent MP chooses not to seek re-election. I would suggest that far too often, a former EDA president or some other party stalwart has the inside track sewn up to win the nomination. Instead of the riding conducting an exhaustive search for the best possible candidate, often out of misplaced loyalty, a majority of the membership in that riding simply give their support to the most familiar face. A leader can, and often does, insist on a more robust nomination process. Secondly, what happens when some wingnut wins the nomination? And it's happened with all parties and often comes to light at the most inappropriate moment, like the midpoint of a campaign. Even when the riding membership wants to forgive their candidate, give him or her the benefit of the doubt, and continue to stand by them, is it fair to the thousands of members, supporters, and volunteers across the country that one candidate in one riding is possibly destroying their opportunity for electoral success, and the leader can't do anything about it? Under our current system, there is always the chance that a constituency with a weak membership can be effectively taken over by a motivated special interest or single issue group. However, there remains the safeguard of the leader's rejection if this selected candidate strays too far from the party's policies. Under C-559, this ultimate protection would cease to exist. And I would argue that the leader is given the mandate from the membership nationwide to ensure the best possible chance to win. And therefore, he or she should ultimately have the final say about who is on his or her team. It has been my experience over many, many years that leaders exercise this authority very rarely and usually only following considerable consultation and reflection. But sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, they must act quickly to try and salvage the campaign. Under Bill C-559, this task would presumably fall to the described nomination officer in that particular riding. But can we, I ask, can we foresee the situation where that elected nomination officer is a close personal friend of the candidate, or perhaps his brother Doug? Just saying. What would be the likelihood that that person would fire the candidate, which unfortunately has proven to be necessary sometimes? Next, the expulsion and the readmission of MPs from or to caucus. Under Michael's proposed legislation, like the removal of the leader and election of an interim leader, the expulsion of an MP from caucus and their possible reinstatement could only be triggered by a written notice of 15% or more of the caucus members supported by a majority secret ballot vote of all MPs that were present. As the longest suffering serving whip, I have some concerns about this as well. I have considerable experience as both whip and House leader under 4 parliamentary parties or entities: the Reform Party, the Canadian Alliance, the PCDR Coalition, and the Conservative Party of Canada, both as official opposition and government. And I can attest, ladies and gentlemen, to the countless hours spent working with, beseeching, cajoling, admonishing, threatening, and punishing colleagues to try to ensure that they remain part of our team. I'm proud of the fact that under my tenure, the ultimate sanction didn't have to be used very often. In fact, I would argue expulsion from caucus happens rarely, under extreme circumstances, and normally only after all other possible options have been exhausted. And I'm thinking here of my former colleague Bill Casey from Nova Scotia, whom I and others, including our leader at the time, unfortunately failed to convince not to vote against our budget in 2007. Now, interestingly, in this case, Bill was rewarded for the position he took when his constituents re-elected him as an independent in 2008. I've had the pleasure to work very closely with my party's leader, I would say the honor, and I can tell you I have the utmost respect, admiration, and sympathy for anyone in any party that takes on that mantle. I've often remarked that as whip, 90% of my time was spent with the 5% of caucus colleagues that were the problem MPs, the renegades, the malcontents, those that all too often are predictably offside with the vast majority of caucus, those who constantly seem to actually enjoy opposing their own leadership, and the media attention and notoriety that comes with the role of a rebel. One of my regrets is that I got to know these individuals very well as they wore out the carpet in and out of my whip's office. But I seldom had the chance to get to know the 95% of caucus that worked hard day after day and were such great team players. And I know, without exception, the leaders that I worked for felt the same way. Like the situation for removal of a candidate, I would argue that there simply isn't time for the caucus to debate, meditate, regurgitate, petition, move motions, and ultimately vote on whether a colleague should be expelled or readmitted to caucus. In however long that process would take, the media and the opposition would have a field day painting that particular leader as indecisive and weak, and in the end, if the caucus overruled the leader and leadership, the public perception could be irreparable. Speaking from considerable experience, I can tell you how difficult it would be to stand before the caucus and single out a colleague to explain in detail the hours and hours of negotiation that went on before the reluctant decision to withdraw his or her membership in the caucus. And in far too many cases, there are extenuating circumstances that no one wants to see made public. And believe me, the process that Michael is advocating in his bill would not remain quietly behind the caucus doors. Finally, the election of the caucus chairman. I don't have strong concerns about this particular reform in C559, but perhaps I might pose the question, why stop there? I believe the NDP still elect their caucus whip. Should there be a debate, would there be merit in electing other caucus officers? And I recall we reformers advocated for many democratic reforms when we first arrived in Ottawa. In fact, we not only wanted to elect all our caucus officers, but we went so far as attempting to change the moniker whip to the far less harsh titled caucus coordinator. However, having held the position of caucus whip, as Preston noted, 4 times and House Leader twice, both in opposition and in government, I would voice caution in this regard. These are very difficult, high-stress positions, and I don't say that simply because I tried my best to fill these roles. Again, speaking from experience, the positions would have been untenable without the complete and unequivocal support of the leader. And of course, this loyalty must flow both ways. The challenge then is to have the necessary loyalty, but it cannot be blind loyalty. In any potential showdown with a caucus colleague, I had to know I had the support and trust of my leader to back me up. If I didn't, then he should immediately replace me. It would be extremely difficult to be torn between choosing the will of the majority of the caucus, who might be very ill-informed about the situation, and the position of the leader, who must constantly consider the best interests of the country, government, party, caucus, and then the individual member. So having said all this, what's my position on Bill C559? I'll think about that for a minute. First, allow me to reiterate my respect and admiration for Michael in bringing this legislation forward. If this bill was to be before the House for 3rd reading, as written, I would have to advocate for MPs to vote against it. But it's not. When it's debated on the floor of the chamber, it will culminate in a 2nd reading vote to have it passed to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee for further study and possible amendment. And that would be my recommendation. In fact, I would go further. I would recommend that the House support this bill unanimously, all parties, all members, and send it to committee for thorough study and consideration. Finally, I would like to briefly touch on a couple of other subjects that perhaps we could delve into in greater detail during our conversation. Over the years, there have been many suggested reforms to our parliamentary system. Indeed, I took some time to look back into the old blue book, Preston, of all our policies back in the early 90s. One finds a fairly extensive list there. More free votes in the House of Commons, MP recall, citizen-initiated referendums, fixed election dates every 4 years, which arguably we have now, and yes, even a commitment in this book all those years ago to end the process of leaders signing off on a candidate's nomination papers. However, I believe that the single greatest change needed is a commitment by all MPs from all parties to begin the task of restoring the respect of Parliament and our democracy. For if members themselves don't exhibit respect, why should Canadians? Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, with your indulgence, I want to end with 3 challenges. One of the reasons that I chose to leave public life when I did was that I found the longer I remained in the House, I was becoming less partisan, at a time when the House became a much nastier place to work. I attribute part of my evolution to the positions I was honored to hold for the majority of the last decade of my career. Undoubtedly, part of this new era of nastiness that we see was due to 3 minority parliaments in a row, where all parties were in constant campaign mode because none of us knew when we'd next be into an election. Now, unfortunately, I believe this atmosphere of non-stop partisanship has continued into the current majority parliament. My longer-term fear is that this, when combined with a new age of instant gotcha politics, will have a long-term effect of dissuading our nation's best and brightest from considering to serve. So my challenge is to all parties, all MPs and senators, and especially to all leaders, to try harder to work collectively and cooperatively in the best interest of Canadians. In my opinion, Parliament has become much too partisan and attacks much too personal. A case in point is the abuse of the 1-minute SO31 member statements prior to the daily question period. And I would suggest that despite the best efforts of our Speaker, Andrew Scheer, to try and shut down those particularly poisonous personal attacks as quickly as he becomes aware of them, that I would suggest we need to go further, and perhaps by all-party agreement, the Speaker should be tasked with striking a committee of the most respected backbench MPs, 1 from each recognized party, that could vet the statements in advance. And I don't see any reason that couldn't be done. And it would at least start the process of quelling the worst partisanship on the floor. Secondly, and I've said this many times previously, I want to challenge our 2 main opposition parties to stop behaving so much as opposition and more like a legitimate government in waiting. I've always believed that democracy under our system is best served when the electorate believes they have a clear choice. That if the government in power, regardless of which party it is, becomes too disconnected, too arrogant, and too self-serving, there is a clear alternative. Disillusioned voters should know that they don't have to stay home and not vote, or vote for another party by default, but that there is an alternative that is clearly ready to govern, not just oppose. And I believe that when this dynamic is present, the result is better government. And thirdly, I want to take this opportunity to challenge the media. And here too, I've done this on previous occasions. We know who holds politicians accountable, but ultimately, who holds the media to account if they get a story wrong? We've all read front-page stories with dramatically torqued headlines that, if you take the time to read the text, has little relation to the facts contained in the story itself. Then, if they're proved to be wrong, the correction or retraction, if printed at all, might be found buried on page 8 in small print. And likewise with the editorializing and the sensationalizing of stories in the electronic media. The presumption of innocence is integral to our justice system. Yet it seems no longer applied to politicians, and I could bore you to tears with examples. Is it any wonder, then, that citizens hold those elected to govern in such disdain? When this guilty until proven innocent attitude of the mainstream media consumes the majority of reporting on Parliament Hill these days, is it so surprising the vast majority of our most successful citizens take a pass on public service, especially if they fully appreciate the negative effect that that life is going to have on a politician's spouse and children? If we want a healthy democracy, ladies and gentlemen, we must find a way to address this. The onus cannot be on the politician to be constantly prepared to prove him or herself innocent, rather than on a more ethical news media to up their threshold for presumed guilt. And finally, and yes, this is my final point, I would like to end with a quote from a politician that, despite his well-documented personal faults, I believe was one of the greatest leaders of our time. Although I cannot help but wonder if he would have survived today's media scrutiny. Winston Churchill, and I quote, "It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all others that have been tried." Thank you.
Great. Well, that's good, Jay. Okay, well, thank you both, and you'll have a chance to get at these gentlemen after the session. But I'll just try to flesh out a few questions here that maybe prompt your thinking or dialogue between you. Maybe start with you, Jay. If I'm right in assessing your position with respect to this particular bill, you would support the principle and intent, but your objections are more to some of the particulars. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, exactly, Preston. And that's why I made the point of commending Michael for his efforts in this regard. I think that a lot more needs to be done. Certainly, my experience was after 17 years in the House of Commons. And I might add that at the epicenter of a lot of the efforts that was made to bring forward legislation. Obviously, that's a big role of the House Leader is trying to get government legislation through, but also working with members with private members' legislation like Michael's. And if there was ever a time, as Michael knows and has made his own personal efforts over the last few years, to see substantive reform to the way in which the House operates, and Michael and I have shared the stage before with suggested reforms to question period, because that's the theater of the absurd that goes on every day for 45 minutes. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of Canadian citizens only see of the House of Commons, is that exchange and question period, which I would argue is probably the worst example of what transpires in our House of Democracy. So yes, I support in principle. Knowing how the process works, I would like to see it, as I said, supported unanimously, sent to committee, and a good thorough study done of all of the potential ramifications of some of these changes that Michael's proposing.
Michael, on the particulars of your bill, you heard Jay suggest that what if the caucus had the power to trigger a leadership review but not actually dispose of the leader? Would that accomplish at least in part of what you're wanting to achieve? Would you like to comment on that suggestion, whether that's a viable alternative or not, or whether you see weaknesses in that position?
I think it's less strong than what the bill currently proposes, but I said right from the day it was introduced in the House of Commons in December that I was open to amendments to strengthen the bill. So I'm open to the committee taking a look at that portion of the bill and suggesting amendments to it. Some people express concerns that the trigger thresholds to trigger a review vote, whether it's of the caucus chair, the party leader, or a caucus member, at 15% is too low. I've indicated I'm open to looking at increasing that threshold. And there's a number of mechanisms we could take a look at putting in place.
In the 90s, when we were going through these mechanisms like referenda, recall, citizens' initiatives, we had these huge debates on what's the effective trigger percentage. And invariably what would happen with public audiences, somebody would argue the low end, or 15%. Somebody that wanted to resist the change would argue 67, 2/3. And of course, the Canadian answer was 41%, which is right halfway in between. I think I would predict where the committee might go on that subject. Maybe come back to you, Jay, on, I think you objected to the removing the leader's capacity to veto a nomination. You remember in the old Reform Constitution, actually, I did not have the power to do that, but the Executive Council had the power to do it. But would you see a place for, if the leader and the Constitution of the party prescribes a nomination meeting has to meet certain absolute criteria. There has to be a search for candidates. There has to be a meeting that's more than 15 people in somebody's basement. There has to be certain criteria. And if the local constituency can prove that it met those 4 criteria, then the leader would be obliged to not interfere with the result. Is that a viable, or you think that's unenforceable?
Well, I think the difficulty with that, I mean, and certainly in principle I would support that there should be a huge responsibility on the membership of whatever party it is in that particular riding to take responsibility for their own candidate and have an active and very thorough search for the best possible candidate, not just from the Conservative Party, but from all of the parties, because then you're ultimately going to end up with the best parliamentarians out of it. The problem I see, and you would be well versed with this as well, Preston, is that all parties have some ridings, some constituencies that they're very strong in. They have a really strong membership base, and then they have some that they're extremely weak in for a number of reasons. And I could see a real problem because there's huge pressure, especially on the 3 big parties, the Conservative Party of Canada, the Liberal Party of Canada, and the New Democratic Party, huge pressure on them to field an entire slate of candidates. So often it arises that you almost have to hold a gun to a head in some of these ridings, because they know they can read the polls as well as anyone else. They know that as a prospective candidate for whichever party and whichever riding, the riding they live in, they have virtually no chance. So they're just a flag bearer. And it takes a lot oftentimes to convince them to actually run for that party and devote, 6 weeks of their life or whatever to carrying the flag in that. So I think that's where the problem would arise, is in the weak ridings where, you'd end up with probably not having a candidate for all the parties and all the ridings.
And you'd support having the leader having still the final word because of that?
For that reason. Yeah. But now, I mean, I think that a discussion and a debate, we could see some compromise there too, with some checks and balance put in so that the leader doesn't have the absolute right to just, on a whim, fire somebody. But as I said in my remarks, I haven't experienced where that's widespread. There's some ample public reason why that individual is being removed.
Well, this was, of course, particularly a problem with the new party. My father used to say a bright light attracts a few bugs. We never figured out how to handle the bugs. What's been your experience, Michael, and I think you've talked to other colleagues in the House of Commons with respect to your bill. What's the state of interest and support among your Conservative colleagues, but also perhaps other opposition members?
Well, we've gotten significant support from all 3 recognized parties in the House of Commons. So that's encouraging. At this point, the vote won't take place till sometime in May of this spring. And so at this point, it's looking promising. I think the next vote on the bill is an easy vote. I think Jay mentioned this. It's a vote at second reading. So it's a vote simply to send the bill to committee for study and amendment. So the only way in which you would vote against this bill at second reading is if you believe that there's absolutely no problem in our system of government, that there's no problem with Parliament, there's no problem in the House of Commons, there's no need to reform the House of Commons, that everything is hunky-dory fine, that there's no centralization of power in Ottawa, and that Parliament is perfect and it doesn't need to be changed at all. That's the only reason why you would vote against it. But many colleagues have said they'll vote for it. They have expressed concerns. One of them is the concern around party nominations. Look, I believe that by restoring local control, we're still going to get the same number of off-message and problem candidates as we do today. I mean, the irony is that in many cases when people debate the bill and express concern about the Reform Act rules for party nominations, they're using examples from the last 2 or 3 general elections. And so the system currently produces problem candidates, and I think it will under the Reform Act rules. But I've also, the other concern people have expressed is that it will allow ridings to be taken over with single-issue candidates. And my response to that is, we need single-issue candidates. William Wilberforce was a single-issue candidate. He fought for decades for the abolishment of slavery in the British Empire. Today in our caucus, part of our party includes many pro-lifers. They got elected because of their strongly held views on the family. And they are valuable and contributing members of our caucus and our coalition. And so we currently get single-issue candidates, people who get involved in politics either because they believe strongly in family issues, or because a loved one was killed and was affected by our criminal justice system. This is what motivates people to get involved, and we shouldn't discourage that or be afraid of it. You know, people have also expressed concerns about, you know, having associations become, you know, as you said, Jay, controlled by Doug, the brother of the candidate. Look, I've said right from the beginning, I'm willing to put some water in the wine and consider amendments. One possible amendment would be to, instead of having a locally elected nomination officer for each electoral district in Canada, you would have a nomination officer for each province and one nomination officer for the 3 territories together. And that nomination officer could be elected by the presidents of the registered electoral districts for that province. And so that provides a mechanism outside of the local riding to provide some check and balance on the local EDA, while at the same time removing the party leader veto. But at the end of the day, I believe strongly that giving the party leaders in law the final approval of our party candidates is too immense a power, and that power has to go.
So these would be suggestions that if this got into committee would be dealt with. We're running out of time, so I'll ask just one more question, general question, and you'll have to be brief in your answers. But I think both of you have looked at other parliaments and what other countries do. Is there any suggestions that you have from looking at what other, particularly countries in the British parliamentary tradition, have done to endeavor to strengthen the backbenchers versus the front benches? Is there any particular examples that you can think of that might be instructive for Canada? You've been to Britain and Australia, I think, Jay. You probably looked at both of them.
Well, you've caught me unawares. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I'm sure there is, because as you suggest, we have studied in the past the other systems, and obviously the real principle of the bill and the changes that Michael's looking at for the Reform Act 2013 has flowed from your research with some of our sister parliaments. So I'm sure there are, but nothing jumps to the forefront right now. I know one of the things we were discussing about changes to question period, for example, was the Australians have a system where you're kind of effectively put in the penalty box if you get too partisan, and the speaker can, there's an intermediate step between chucking you out of the house and actually just admonishing you the way it happens in our parliament. So there are things we can learn.
In a black and white suit with a whistle and replace. Yeah, what about Mike?
Well, Preston, I think the Reform Act would do exactly that. It would restore some balance between the front bench and the back bench in all the parties, and do so in a way that applies the rules consistently to all the parties, and do so in a way that's transparent and clear, that would write the rules down on paper as they have been put on paper in other Westminster parliamentary democracies. Look, Parliament's not an old boys club anymore. 150 years ago, Parliament was an old boys club. It was made up of males, elected by males, and it was governed largely by unwritten rules and unwritten conventions. Political parties 100 years ago were private organizations. We don't live in that era anymore. Parliament is a public institution. Political parties receive vast sums of public money. They are quasi-public institutions. It's time to take these unwritten conventions, unwritten rules, put them down on paper, strengthen and reinforce the accountability of the party leaders to their party caucuses, and empower MPs.
The British Parliament has gone more down that road, don't they, in actually having rules, caucus.
That's right.
Visible caucus rules.
The Conservative Party of the United Kingdom has put the rules down in a document called the Fresh Futures document. It's considered by the 1922 committee, their national caucus, to be a precedent-setting document. It's stored at the Library of Parliament in the UK. The Labour Party of the United Kingdom, as is the case with the Labour Party of New Zealand and the National Party of New Zealand and the Labour Party of Australia, have written the rules into their party constitutions. The bill, the Reform Act, simply says, let's write the rules down as well. They, for too long, have not been written down, and it's been too vague and opaque.
Okay, on that note, we shall end. Let's thank our speakers today for